The European Union is a very interesting topic, and today I want to take a look at what the EU takes from its 27 member states and what it gives in return, and what all of this means for you personally.
To you, the people.
If you like this kind of content, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. Let's get started by looking at what does the EU take. The EU has a pretty impressive budget, 160 billion euros in 2022 alone.
No way!
The vast majority of this sum comes from forced contributions of its member states. Using the 2020 numbers in billion euros, the biggest contributors are Germany 28, France 23.7, UK 17, I guess that party ended now, Italy 16.6, Spain 11, the Netherlands 5.8, Poland 4.9, Belgium 4.7, Sweden 4, Austria 3.5. On average, an EU citizen pays 250 euros per year to the EU. This might not sound like much. Keep in mind that this is on average. So citizens of wealthier nations pay far more than this. And if you were to invest 250 euro per year in some sort of investment which brings you an 8% return, like an index fund, and you reinvest the profit, after roughly 30 years, you would have had an extra 28,547 euros. A pretty decent sum for most average people. Put it that way, and the EU does in fact take quite a decent chunk of money from each person, and that's not even counting all the heavy taxes. There are countries who contribute more than they get out of the EU monetarily speaking, so-called net contributors. These are Germany, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and Ireland. These countries cough up more money to make up for the following nations who take more than they give: Poland, Greece, Romania, Hungary, Portugal, Czech Republic, Belgium, Luxembourg, and so on. The UK used to also be a net contributor until they had enough of it and left the EU. They were the first, but will they be the last? Probably not. As the West continues to collapse, it's likely other nations will realize they cannot afford the train anymore. How is this fair, you might ask? It isn't. So how did they end up with this system? Each country pays the same proportion of its national income to the EU budget, so richer countries pay more and poor countries pay less. In addition, the European Union takes 75% of the customs duties, agricultural duties, and sugar levies collected by each member state when goods enter the customs union. Yes, you heard that right, 75%. Where does this money go? Here's a rough division of how the EU budget gets spent. It changes a bit every year, but the general layout stays the same. 48% on smart and inclusive growth, 35% sustainable growth, natural resources, 6% on global Europe, 6% on administration, 7% on security and citizenship, asylum, education, and culture, 6% on special instruments. In short and in simpler terms, roughly 75% of this massive budget goes to agriculture and development of poorer areas of the EU. In other words, wealth redistribution. If you're like me and at least somewhat libertarian oriented, you're probably getting chills by now. However, let's also check out what does the EU give. Now, let's start this section with a quote from the site of the EU itself. The EU budget is not a zero-sum game. Everybody wins from EU membership, enjoying borderless travel, affordable phone calls from abroad, and a coordinated EU response to the and its consequences. All EU member states benefit from being part of the single market, addressing the challenges of migration and fighting terrorism and climate change together, as well as from better roads, modernized public services, and cutting-edge medical treatment. They also wish to preemptively address critics. The narrative about how much each EU country is getting out of the budget versus how much they are contributing is therefore flawed. This narrative does not take into account member states' benefits from the single market, neither does it measure the business opportunities that cohesion policy, the EU's main investment policy, creates for businesses from across the Union. The EU contributes significantly to the economies of its member states, and this is completely ignored in these calculations. Sounds like a lot of vacuous justification to me, and there's no mention of the absurdly high taxes this system necessitates, the often unelected, extremely high paid, and sometimes corrupt army of bureaucrats, and the generally authoritarian vibe of the whole thing. With that being said, I cannot disagree with the statement that the concept of the EU does provide a lot to its member states, such as open borders, a common currency, easier trading, and, well, that's about it, I guess. International security, maybe? But no, that's NATO's territory. Enforcing international law? Nope, that's the UN. And if a member state like Hungary or Poland refuses to cooperate with this insane, nation destroying tactic, they get met by harsh criticism and sanctions. If we put the previous two sections back to back, is the EU worth it? Let's take a look at what all these numbers boil down to. Yes, there is no doubt in my mind that the concept of the EU has some merits. Like the quote from earlier stated, borderless travel, affordable phone calls from abroad, and a coordinated EU response to the and its consequences. I think it's fair to just ignore the silly boast about affordable phone calls from abroad in a time of global internet, and how on earth they think their overreaction to the and the subsequent disaster for their economies was in any way something to be proud of is beyond me. However, open borders are great for trade. One currency is great for convenience, I can't deny that, but not so much when it crashes, which it certainly can do, because an economic disaster in one country can then impact all the other nations. This reinforces broken systems like central banks and can and almost certainly will lead to even greater global economic disasters down the line. Having every country contribute the same percentage of its national income sounds fair in principle, very democratic, but what this leads to in practice is poorer countries taking advantage of richer countries, who are slowly being sapped of their funds in many ways. This is a redistribution of wealth, ultimately aimed at making the states all equal, but those who contribute most also gain the least. In other words, socialism, Marxism, from each according to his ability to each according to his need. The EU imposes strict rules on its member states, and if a state doesn't agree with those rules, well, there's no choice really. Conform or get severely punished through sanctions. Authoritarianism covered in a veneer of democracy. Has the EU made its member states safer? Well, no. Crime is rising in nearly every country, due to a multitude of factors, not in the least the already mentioned the rising cost of living and higher than they could be taxes. In conclusion, I like the concept of the EU. I think individual nations working together for mutual gain is great, and definitely the way forward towards a prosperous planet, but not in the tyrannical and inefficient way the EU is doing it, by imposing and enforcing quotas and restrictions, high taxes, and wealth redistribution. Just look at successful collaborations of nations such as Mercosur or ASEAN, and you'll see how this could be handled much better. Nations working together, yet safeguarding their autonomy. The EU is a massive underlying reason why Europe is collapsing, and this system cannot last. The UK got out already, and it won't be the last country to realize that the EU takes more than it gives. Within a few decades, we'll see a massive shift in how the Western world works, and I fear Europe will be the first to fall. Get out while you still can. Anyway, that's about all I've got for today. If you want more information about this topic, why the Western world is collapsing, and how you can make sure you're protected, check out my book up on Amazon, link in the description. Thank you all so much for watching, and see you in the next video.